Hello everyone, my name is Alex, and welcome to the first ever episode of Placeholder History. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I have worked really hard to get this video up, and I'm extremely excited to be making my debut on YouTube. Hopefully after watching this video, you guys will be excited too. I'm looking forward to reading the comments and seeing your responses so I can improve future episodes, but for now, let's not waste any time and just jump right in. So, I've been listening to Hamilton, and watched it admittedly more than a few times since it came out on Disney Plus last year, and this has spurred me into doing more research into the American Revolution. My deep dive into the period has left me with a lot of fun facts and nobody to share them with, so I decided to do a little series on the United States and its birth. In order to talk about the American Revolution, we have to first establish the context that surrounded the uprising and the subsequent war. Otherwise, you just have people throwing dried plants into the Atlantic, and while that is technically what happened, it's a much less interesting way of telling the story. So, first comes first. Why and how did the British Empire have control of the North American continent in the first place? Well, that all started with the exploration craze that struck Europe during the Renaissance. Europeans began to get a kick out of sailing into the great unknown, mostly to get past the airtight grip that the Ottomans held on trade with the East. Portugal launched the first few expeditions in the Atlantic starting in the early 15th century, laying claim to territories all along the African coast. The Spanish then began sponsoring their own expedition a few years later, starting with Christopher Columbus, who, while sailing the ocean blue in 1492, discovered an island which he promptly claimed for the Spanish crown. He supposedly called the native inhabitants Indians because he believed this island he'd found was a part of Indonesia. What Columbus had actually discovered was the Bahamas in the Caribbean. In 1494, Portugal and Spain would then go to sign a treaty with the Pope, called the Treaty of Tordesillas. It essentially split the entire world in half along this line right here. Portugal would get all the non-Christian nobody's land east of the line, and Spain got all the non-Christian nobody's land to the west of it. Portugal would claim the territory of Brazil shortly after in the year 1500. This new world would eventually come to be called the Americas, named after Amerigo Vespucci, who explored the Caribbean Sea and South American coastline between 1499 and 1502. These expeditions resulted in a book by the name of Mundus Novus, Latin for New World, in 1502 and 1503, that disproved Columbus's initial assumption. The islands he had discovered were not part of Indonesia, but actually part of an entirely unknown group of continents across the ocean. Land ripe for the taking, filled with untouched natural resources. And so the race to grab up this land began. The Spanish kicked it off when they began to transport troops and settlers to the New World under the slogan of gold, glory, and God. They aimed to Christianize the New World through Reconquista, something they'd done against the Muslims who had been residing on the Iberian Peninsula already. They also wanted to harvest as many riches from the New World as they could. Silver, gold, tobacco, sugar, all were things that the Spanish and other European nations would farm and mine in their colonies over the many years of European rule in the Americas. Spain wouldn't officially begin their Reconquista until 1519, with the invasion of Aztec territory led by Hernán Cortés. But even before this Reconquista, the lives of Native Americans were endangered by an even more terrifying threat. Europeans carried a lot of things with them on the boats that they traveled to the New World in. Food, clothing, supplies for repairs or to construct shelters with. But one of the most dangerous things they would take with them was disease. Europe was a hotbed for sickness in the late medieval and early Renaissance period. Illnesses like smallpox, typhus, measles, and cholera all traveled to the New World aboard both animals and people. Between disease, enslavement, and wars against native tribes and nations, the Native American population would decrease by nearly 50 million people before the year 1600. This widespread devastation would come to be called the Great Dying. Meanwhile, however, throughout the early periods of colonization, European populations in the Americas would only continue to grow. So, we've reached the year 1600. Spain, France, and Portugal have all staked claims in the Americas, but notably, the English haven't come up in this video. Not yet, at least. If they played such a major role in the colonial period and the rise of the United States, you'd think they'd have already settled down in the Americas, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The English, as they were still called since the British Empire didn't exist at the time, wouldn't have a permanent colony in the Americas until 1607. They'd only made one other attempt before this point, with the failed colony of Roanoke. And yes, that is the famous one that disappeared into thin air. It was actually settled twice, with the first in 1585 by Ralph Lane. It was located in Chesapeake Bay, on Hatteras Island, in what is modern-day North Carolina, but they would move to Roanoke Island shortly before evacuating. The colony was abandoned due to a lack of food and poor relations with the surrounding Native American tribes that had resulted in several skirmishes. They returned to England in 1586. The second attempt, in 1587, was the much more infamous expedition led by John White. This group settled on Roanoke Island and would establish a small colony of about 120 men and women, including White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, who gave birth to Virginia Dare on August 18, 1587. This would mark the first English colonists born in the New World. John White would have to leave for England later that year, intending to return in early 1588 with supplies for the colony. His return would be delayed, however, until the year 1590, due to Spain gathering a massive armada to fight the English, and the English in turn making their own armada to counter-invade Spain. He would finally make it to the Americas and moor his boat overnight off the coast of Roanoke Island. They would sing English songs, hoping the colonists would hear them since they'd seen plumes of smoke coming from the island earlier. When they finally made landfall the next morning, which just so happened to be the same day as his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, White and his crew would find the colony's boats to be missing and footprints along the sand, but no European settlers. They'd venture further inland to the site of the village and discover it to be totally abandoned. A palisade wall had been constructed around the houses, which had been dismantled at some point, and anything valuable or able to be carried was gone. Even John White's own chest of valuables that he'd left behind was missing entirely. The only sign that the settlers had even been there was the words C-R-O carved into a tree, and Croatoan carved into one of the palisade walls. Now, the settlers had agreed way back in 1587 that they'd leave a sign for White if they relocated, so he initially assumed that that's what this was, but he'd never get the chance to investigate. The anchor line of his ship snapped, and he was forced to return to England early. That was the last anyone would see of the Roanoke colony, and even today nobody has figured out what happened to it or the settlers. These two failures of the Roanoke colony left the English lagging behind other colonial powers of the era. They wouldn't make another attempt at a permanent colony until 1607, with the Jamestown colony right about here. Along the coast of Virginia, the colony was established on May 14, 1607 by the riverbanks of the Powhatan. Originally called Fort James, the settlement would be the first permanent English colony in the Americas. But it would be off to a rough start. Disease and starvation nearly wiped out the garrison of Fort James between 1609 and 1610, forcing the settlers to leave the fort and nearly abandon the colony altogether. Luckily for them, they happened to run into a supply ship headed for the fort on their trip downriver, and so they returned, the colony was resettled, and it remained a permanent fixture of the Virginia colony until 1690, when it was burnt down during an uprising of slaves and servants called the Bacon's Rebellion. Jamestown, however, wasn't the only American colony to spring up during the early 1600s. Other English settlements in the Americas included Bermuda, which was settled in 1609 and is now the oldest standing European settlement in the Americas, Newfoundland in 1610, Plymouth Colony in 1620, where the Pilgrims landed to escape the Anglican Church and build their own Protestant colony, and finally Barbados in 1627. However, the 13 colonies as we know them have not yet taken form. It's mostly small towns and homesteads, loosely organized into general regions headed by some sort of governor. Normally, the governor was a noble or a businessman with a charter to claim land and work on it, with the promise that the colony would turn a profit for the crown. Farming was the major occupation of English settlers at this time. Tobacco was being popularized, sugar was all the rage back in England, and cotton was quickly becoming a popular export as well. These would remain staples of the American economy all the way up to the Industrial Revolution some 200 years later. However, in order to make enough for the European nations back home, massive plantations were required to be constructed and planted. These plantations required an even larger amount of manpower to run efficiently, and a large amount of that work would initially come through indentured servitude until the late 1600s. Indentured servitude is an indirect form of slavery that involved a man working for someone else for a set number of years with no pay in exchange for land that they would then own and farm by themselves. However, this trend would begin to change as the enslavement and sale of native Africans became more and more popular within the colonies. By 1675, the transatlantic slave trade had gone into full swing, and the English settlers were now one of its top customers. The transatlantic slave trade system worked a little something like this. Slaves, gold, and some pepper would be taken from the African coast and loaded onto cramped boats. African people who had been captured and enslaved were packed in with little room to move. Many of them would die on the trip across the Atlantic. Those who survived were taken first to the West Indies, where they were sold for things like molasses and sugar. This new load of cargo was taken to the Americas, where more slaves were sold, and some of the molasses and sugar was traded for iron, lumber, furs, whale oil, tobacco, cotton, and other products of that sort. This new cargo was then taken back to Europe to be sold, in turn allowing the slave traders to then go and purchase more slaves in Africa. This was a vicious cycle that would continue all the way into the 19th century, resulting in the enslavement and transport of some 10 million people, and also resulting in the deaths of an untold amount. This reliance on slavery would drive colonial expansion all the way into the early 1700s, particularly in the British colonies, where the economy boomed as a result of this new source of unpaid labor. The colonies would grow at an unprecedented rate, and finally start to take the shape of the 13 that we're most familiar with. I'll go ahead and list them for you now, in the order of their founding. Virginia was the first, founded in 1607 and shooting off from the Jamestown colony. Massachusetts would come next, shooting off from the Plymouth colony in 1620. New Hampshire would follow in 1623, then Maryland in 1632-34. Connecticut and Rhode Island were both founded in 1636. Delaware was founded in 1638. North and South Carolina were both founded in 1663, and New York, which was originally New Amsterdam, was stolen from the Dutch in 1664. New Jersey was settled next in 1665, Pennsylvania in 1681, and finally Georgia, which was settled in 1683 as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the Carolinas. By 1700, these colonies had become firmly established. They had a total population of about 260,000 colonists, and were providing valuable sources of income and resources to the British Crown. The colonies would become an irreplaceable part of the European balance of power, which of course would come to spark a lot of tension in the early to mid-1700s. This tension would come to a violent crescendo with the onset of the French and Indian War, which would begin in 1754. However, this war has a lot going on and really deserves an episode all on its own, so I think now is probably a really good spot to end this first episode. If you've watched all the way to the end, thanks! I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video, and I invite you to check out the second episode once it's uploaded. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you all next time on Placeholder History.